Hello and welcome to Western Roman history. At that time, they say, that the Emperor Honorius in Ravenna received the message from one of the eunuchs, evidently a keeper of the poultry, that Rome had perished. And he cried out and said, "Yet he just ate from my hands," for he had a huge rooster, Rome by name. The eunuch, comprehending his words, said that it was the city of Rome that had perished, at the hands of Alaric. The emperor answered with a sigh of relief, but I, my good fellow, thought that my fowl Rome had perished." So great, they say, was the folly with which this emperor was possessed. Perhaps the most famous portrayal of Honorius is Procopius's tale of what Honorius said after hearing that Rome, the city that had conquered the world, was herself conquered. But is there any truth to this legend, retold over a century later? The following video explores the infamous reign of Honorius Augustus. Honorius was born on the 9th of September AD 384 in Constantinople to Theodosius I and his wife Aelia Flaccilla. In 386, Honorius was consul, and in 393, he was proclaimed Augustus in opposition to the usurper Eugenius in the west. He was moved to Milan in 394, following his father's victory over the usurper. When his father died on the 17th of January 395, Honorius became Western Emperor at the age of 10. Too young to actually rule, Stilicho, his master of infantry in the emperor's presence, assumed the regency of Honorius, claiming he had been appointed as guardian over both of Theodosius' sons. AD 395 marked the beginning of the de facto division of the empire into its eastern and western halves. Each had its own court, its own emperor, and own armies, but in theory the empire remained a single entity. Since Honorius was still a young teenager, Stilicho was effectively in command. Immediately, Stilicho came into conflict with the court of Constantinople, which was run by a succession of political strongmen throughout Arcadius' reign. Rufinus, the Praetorian prefect of the east, quickly took charge of Arcadius' court and blocked Stilicho's political ambitions. A cold war began between the court of Stilicho and Arcadius that did not end until the death of both parties in 408. On the 27th of November 395, after returning to Constantinople with the army from the civil war with Eugenius, Rufinus was assassinated by Gainas in front of Arcadius himself. Gainas was a Gothic commander and, on this occasion, a partisan of Stilicho. Even Stilicho's court orator, Claudian, said that Stilicho orchestrated Rufinus' murder. Meanwhile, Stilicho and Honorius issued laws concerning compulsory public service, ecclesiastical privileges, and the reform of the African annona, the grain supply to Rome. In 397, the Visigoths, led by Alaric, invaded the Peloponnese and sacked Corinth, Sparta, and Eleusis. Honorius gave Stilicho the authority to intervene to protect Greece, since the court of Arcadius did not act. Stilicho sailed with an army to the Peloponnese and defeated Alaric. Stilicho was on the verge of securing the total surrender of the Visigoths when the court and senate of Constantinople, led by the eunuch Eutropius, declared Stilicho a hostis publicus. They demanded he leave their portion of the empire. Stilicho agreed and withdrew with the Western Roman army. Later that year, Gildo, the Count of Africa, in consort with Eutropius, tried to transfer the province of Africa to eastern jurisdiction. Gildo had close ties to the Donatist Christian bishop Optatus and may have received their support. He also cut off the grain supply to Rome. The province of Africa was the Western Roman Empire's most important province economically. It could not be lost. Stilicho immediately responded by marshalling an army to confront the renegade Gildo. Conscripts were drafted for the purpose, even from imperial estates. Senators were also forced to pay 25 solidi and associated expenses or send recruits from their personal estates. Stilicho secured new sources of food for Rome to prevent starvation, and he received the Senatus Consultum from the Senate to approve his war against Gildo. Honorius himself wanted to accompany the expedition, but was prevented by his guardian. When the troops were ready to leave, Honorius gave a speech, of which some element has been preserved by Claudian in his panegyric on the Gildonic War. "My men, so soon to bring defeat upon Gildo, now is the time to fulfill your promises and make good your threats. If you felt indignation on my behalf, now take up arms and prove it. Wash out the stain of civil war by means of a great and deserved triumph. Obedience and discipline are unknown in their ranks. Their arms a burden to them. Their salvation lies in flight. Though each has many wives, ties of family bind them not, nor have they any love for their children, whose very number causes affection to fail. Such are the troops. Their chief will come to battle crowned with roses, drenched with scents, his last feast still undigested, drunken with wine, ruined with age, enervated with disease and venery. Let the war trumpet rouse him from a bed of incest. Is not death preferable to a life disgraced? If, in addition to the loss of Illyria, Africa is to be surrendered to Moorish kings, what lands still remain to us? Go, win back that southern realm a rebel has torn from me. It depends on your arms whether Rome, the unconquerable mistress of the world, stands or falls. Fight but one battle in defence of Libya. Let empire restored attend on your oars and sails. Give back to Africa the laws of Rome she now disregards. Let history repeat itself, and the sword smite from its trunk the head of this third tyrant, and so end at last the series of bloody usurpers." Stilicho appointed the brother of Gildo, Mascezel, to command the army, which left in late 397. The appointment may have been a political move to stop Honorius going on campaign, to let a Gildo fight a Gildo, and allow Mascezel to wreak vengeance on his brother. It was a sign that the nature of rule had changed. Emperors were no longer to go on campaign in person. They were to remain in the palace and become a director of affairs, delegating the command of the army to others, a style of rule that would only alter with Emperor Heraclius. This new mode of rule was also adopted in the East by the emperors Arcadius and Theodosius II. By the 6th century, it had seemed to the historian John the Lydian as if Theodosius I had written a law banning his sons from leading armies, perhaps, as John suggested, because they were incapable of leading them. Mascezel's army travelled to Sicily and Sardinia to gather supplies. They then landed in Africa and fought Gildo in a battle. It took place between January and May 398, but very little information survives on the war. Orosius tells us Mascezel had 5,000 soldiers and Gildo 70,000, a ludicrous number. Despite Gildo outnumbering Mascezel, the latter routed Gildo's army. The rebel then fled to his supporters among the Berber tribes in Roman territory. He took a ship, possibly destined for Constantinople, but it ran aground near Fabraca on the Tunisian coast. Gildo was captured and attacked by a mob in the streets of the town. On the 31st of July, 398, he was tried for treason and executed. Jordanes and Zosimus say Gildo committed suicide, and so as Jordanes says, he may have strangled himself with his own hand. Either way, the Gildonic War was over. Gildo's estates were confiscated, but were so large they had to have a special ministry set up to manage them. For the next 10 years, the associates of Gildo were hunted down and punished. From now on, only trusted men were placed in charge of Africa. A triumphal arch was built in Rome to commemorate the destruction of the rebel Gildo. Upon returning to Italy to see Honorius, Mascezel died. Zosimus says Stilicho was jealous of Mascezel's achievement. He says, Zosimus, New History, 511-4. One day, as Stilicho was crossing a bridge on his way to one of the suburbs with Masgelados among his attendants, his guards, on a previously arranged signal, pushed him into the river, and while Stilicho laughed, he was swept away by the current and drowned. Orosius gives a different version, where through the judgment of God, Masgazel was executed for dragging refugees from a church who had sought sanctuary. In 398, Honorius married his cousin Maria, the daughter of Stilicho, connecting the master of soldiers directly to the imperial family. Maria was roughly 12 years old, and Honorius was 13. An inter-cousin marriage was heavily frowned upon by both the Christian St. Augustine and the pagan Zosimus because of its consanguinity. According to Claudian, Maria did not find out she was to be married until the wedding day. A question should be raised as to why Honorius never had children. He was married to Maria until 407 or 404. When she died, he married her sister Thermantia until 408. Zosimus says that Serena, Stilicho's wife, was so opposed to the marriage that she hired a herbalist to drug Honorius and make him flaccid. However, this is a story based on Eunapius, who, though contemporary, was well removed from the Western court. As Eunapius himself admitted, personal facts about an emperor, even a dead one, could be difficult to obtain. In addition, since this was a political marriage, why would Serena, who also stood to gain by it through Stilicho, want to sabotage it? The most obvious answer for why Honorius never had children was because he was sterile. In 399, Claudian gave 2 invectives against the eunuch Eutropius, who had been executed by Arcadius. Both emperors issued a law condemning his memory, which also showed a restoration of relations between the 2 courts. It was also in this year that Honorius famously passed his sumptuary law banning the wearing of trousers in Rome. Within the city of Rome, no person shall wear either trousers or boots. But if any man, after the insurance of this regulation of our clemency, should obstinately persist in such contumacy, he shall be punished according as his legal status permits, and expelled from our sacred city. One of Honorius's most memorable changes was the banning of gladiatorial games. Theodoret recalls that an ascetic called Telemachus travelled to Rome and attempted to break up a gladiatorial fight, and the crowd stoned Telemachus to death for interrupting the game. Honorius made Telemachus a martyr and ended gladiatorial fights. However, there is no survival legal evidence to suggest he ever made such a law, nor later reiterations. Nor is the story related in the other contemporary church histories of Sozomen, Socrates, and Philostorgius. The only Honorian law related to gladiators is a restriction in 399 on the enlisting of gladiators as personal bodyguards. It is possible that Theodoret may just be relating a hagiographical story that incorporated a natural decline in the attendance of gladiator fights. However, people were still fighting wild beasts in the arena until 439. Honorius, gladiators aside, was a steadfast proponent of Nicene Christianity. Honorius frequently used the word Catholic in his laws. The historian Honoré remarked that 30 of the 60 mentions in the Codex Theodosianus of the word Catholicus come from the reign of Honorius. All but 1 are from the Ravenna period. The 11 texts that use the word Orthodox are all Eastern, so that, although Catholicus is freely used in the East also, the divide between Eastern and Western Christianity begins to mark the language of legislation. See page 229. In 393, Honorius's officials demolished temples and smashed pagan god statues. In 400, Honorius initiated a large-scale repair and upgrade of the Aurelian walls around Rome. The prefect of Rome, Macrobius Longinianus, oversaw the works and repaired the walls, gates, and towers. The 19 square kilometers of walls were doubled in height to 16 meters. The existing towers were extended, and new ones were built. The Honorian improvements can still be seen today. The Western Roman Empire continued in peace until 401. The main worry at the time was the need for Honorius to sire a child. Stilicho still remained in control, perhaps increasingly so, since in Claudian's panegyrics, Honorius is barely mentioned, despite extolling Stilicho. In 401, Stilicho marched with the Italian army to fight the Franks who were attacking Raetia. In November 401, Alaric, leader of the Visigoths and master of soldiers of Illyricum, marched into Italy. He sought loot and land to settle on. After spending decades fighting the east, the Visigoths tried their luck dealing with the west. Alaric besieged the western Roman capital of Milan. Stilicho was away fighting the Franks. Many people saw Stilicho's absence as purposeful betrayal. Rutilius Nematianus, 41-52, said, "Bitter is the crime of cursed Stilicho, in that he was betrayer of the empire's secret. He let loose the arms of the barbarians to the death of Latium." It seems far more likely that the Visigoths caught Stilicho completely by surprise. Stilicho may have misjudged how much time he had to deal with the Franks before the Visigoths arrived. Nevertheless, most of the sources blame him for the invasion, and even accuse him of collusion. Honorius drilled his cavalry in preparation for the Visigothic attack. Claudian speaks of his being charged by 2 wolves that were killed with throwing darts. Claudian records Honorius' speech to the Milanese for the impending siege, saying, "He threatened to block me in, cherishing the hope that perhaps in vain terror, with the garrisons all gone, and with fear pressing hard upon me, I might make terms with him on any conditions that he liked. But no fear shook my constancy." Stilicho rushed to Milan. He famously stripped troops from other frontiers to muster enough in the face of the Gothic threat. Claudian, in his The Gothic War, 414-423, reports that, "First hasten up the neighbouring troops, their loyalty attested by their defence of Raetia, and the mass of spoil from Vindelicia. Next, the legion that has been left to guard Britain, the legion, Legio II Augusta, that kept the fierce Scots in check, whose men had scanned the strange devices tattooed on the faces of the dying Picts, even the legions that faced the flaxen-haired Sigambri, and those who held the Chatti and wild Cherusci in subjugation, hither turn their threatening arms, leaving the Rhine, whose garrison they had formed, defended by but one thing, the fear of Rome." Will any posterity credit the tale? Germany, once the home of people so proud and fierce that former emperors could scarce keep them in check with the whole weight of their armies, now offers herself so willingly a follower of Stilicho's guiding hand, that she neither attempts an invasion of the territory exposed to her attack by the removal of its frontier troops, nor crosses the stream, too timid to approach an undefended bank. Stilicho defeated the Visigoths at the Battle of Pollentia on the 6th of April 402, and again at the Battle of Verona. In either the summer or in 403, Stilicho forced Alaric to leave Italy. Stilicho had been unable to defeat the Visigoths because many of his own troops were ill-disciplined foederati. Jordanes retains a tradition that Honorius and Stilicho betrayed the Visigoths after a promise of land to later justify Alaric's sack of Rome. In September 401 to December 402, Honorius transferred his court to Ravenna. It was much safer than Milan, since it was next to the sea and surrounded by mountains and swamps. In addition, Ravenna's access to the Adriatic was better than the landlocked Milan or Rome for communication and supplies. In 404, Honorius became consul for the 6th time, performed an adventus and triumph in Rome for the victory over the Visigoths. Notably, he included a visit to St. Peter's Basilica as part of the triumph, demonstrating how older Roman practices were being adapted by their Christian practitioners. Notably, Stilicho stood on the triumphator's chariot as Honorius' equal during the triumph. Claudian recited a panegyric, and after this event, we hear no more of the pagan orator. Once Empress Maria died, Honorius commissioned a family mausoleum in Rome, either a new structure or a repurposed one on Vatican Hill. In 405, Stilicho held his second consulship. He petitioned Arcadius to help him defeat the Visigoths in Illyricum. Arcadius refused. The court at Constantinople was still very hostile towards Stilicho. Instead, Stilicho appointed Alaric as master of soldiers for Illyricum to placate him. Olympiodorus wrote about the situation, fragment 1.2. While Arcadius was still alive, he became hostile to the ministers of that emperor and planned to bring the two parts of the empire to war. He recommended that Alaric, the leader of the Goths, be given a Roman generalship, and urged him to seize Illyricum. He also sent ahead Jovius, who had been made praetorian prefect of that region, and promised that he would quickly join him with the Roman troops in order to bring the population there under Honorius' rule. Alaric, collecting those under his command, quitted the barbarian lands by Dalmatia and Pannonia, where he was dwelling, and led his men to Epirus. There he waited for a long time, and then retreated to Italy, having achieved nothing. The obstinance of Arcadius' ministers was bringing the two courts into conflict again. However, Stilicho never acted on this planned invasion of the Eastern Roman Empire due to the invasion of Radagaisus. In the autumn of 405, Italy was threatened again. Radagaisus, a Goth, leading a coalition of barbarians said to number 200,000 to 400,000 strong, smashed through the frontier defences and entered Italy. King Radagaisus divided his army into three and sacked many cities. He besieged Florence with his main force, while the rest devastated the countryside. While the numbers of the barbarian army are exaggerated, it was still enormous. Stilicho mustered the Italian army at Ticinum and hired troops from the Alans and Huns. Stilicho needed more soldiers. A law of Honorius preserves the extraordinary recruitment drive taken to raise a force large enough to match Radagaisus. Emperors Arcadius, Honorius, and Theodosius Augustus to the provincials. In the matter of defence against hostile attacks, we order that consideration be given not only to the legal status of soldiers, but also to their physical strength. Although we believe that freeborn persons are aroused by love of fatherland, we exhort slaves also, by the authority of this edict, that soon as possible they shall offer themselves for the labours of war, and they shall receive their arms as men fit for military service. They shall obtain the reward of freedom, and they shall receive 2 solidi each for travel expenses. Especially, of course, do we urge this service upon the slaves of those persons who are retained in the armed imperial service, and likewise upon slaves of federated allies and of conquered peoples, since it is evident that they are making war also amongst their masters. Given on the 15th of February, 406. Honorius issued another levy, Theodosian Code 7:13-17. On account of our imminent necessities by this edict, we summon to military service all men who are aroused by the innate spirit of freedom. Freeborn person, therefore, takes arms under the auspices of military service for love of peace and of fatherland. We shall know they will receive 10 solidi each for our imperial treasure when affairs have been concluded. However, we order that 3 of the aforesaid sum be paid each man now, for we believe that the best soldiers will be those whose courage and concern for the public weal have brought them forward for the present needs. Given on the 15th of February, 406. Zosimus records Stilicho's army being 30 numera in number, although it is probably not being used in its exact term. Stilicho's Roman forces probably amounted to 30,000 men, if each unit had the standard late Roman legion, or 15,000 if it was made up of the smaller 500-man vexiliations. Stilicho also hired many Alans and Huns. Stilicho used the Hunnish cavalry to attack Radagaisus' foraging parties, and Stilicho defeated his army at the Arno River. Radagaisus tried to extricate his army. Once he became trapped in Faesulae, he tried to escape and was executed. Stilicho was universally honoured for freeing Italy miraculously from such inevitable danger. Olympiodorus also adds that 12,000 Goths were recruited into Stilicho's army. With Radagaisus defeated, Stilicho resumed his plan to wrestle Illyricum from the Eastern Roman Empire with the aid of Alaric, quartered in Epirus. The shadow of Radagaisus' invasion would be long felt. On the 31st of December, 405, a coalition of Alans, Vandals, and Suebi defeated the Frankish kingdom and crossed the Rhine River, defeating local Roman forces at Mainz. The details of the Rhine crossing is a hotly debated topic in scholarship. Drinkwater speculated that the three tribes were formerly part of Radagaisus' coalition, circling back against another Roman frontier for plunder. He also conjectured that morale may have been low due to changing the prefectural capital from Trier to Lyon. The invaders lay waste to Gaul. Orientus of Ulk recalled in his commentary, "Throughout every neighbourhood, villa, crossroad, and rural district, there was death, grief, destruction, slaughter, fire, and mourning." There are many similar accounts. The Gallic Chronicle of 452 records, "The fury of various peoples began to tear Gaul to pieces." Importantly, Zosimus records, "The Vandals, in conjunction with the Suevi and Alani, crossed these Alps and plundered the provinces beyond them. They wrought such slaughter and became so formidable, even to the armies in Britain, that they compelled them, under fear of attack, to elect usurpers, namely Marcus, Gratian, and then Constantine." The field army in Britain, which had been returned after Alaric's first invasion, elevated Marcus as emperor to provide local leadership, with Britain being cut off from the Honorian government. Nothing is known about him, but in 407 he was murdered and replaced by Gratian. The second usurper was a native of Britain and reigned for 4 months before being himself murdered by his army and replaced by Constantine. Constantine III, as he is known, was supposedly elected emperor because of his name, Flavius Claudius Constantine, which was similar to Constantine the Great, something he himself heavily promoted in his propaganda. Other causes for the British usurpers have been given to explain the revolt. The most authoritative of these is that the legions were demoralised by several years of irregular payment of their wages, partially because their money had to be moved from Gaul to Britain. While an interesting proposal, supported by Drinkwater, Kulikowski asserts the importance of Zosimus, emphasising that the direct cause of the revolt was due to the invasion of Gaul. Constantine III and his army crossed over the English Channel and headed directly for Lyon, which Drinkwater has argued was the new headquarters of the Praetorian prefect of Gaul. In 408, Constantine III captured Arles, which became his capital. He started minting coins that heavily emphasised his entry into the imperial college with Arcadius, Theodosius II, Honorius, and himself. It would imply that Constantine III's immediate objective was not to overthrow Honorius, but to protect Gaul, at least at the beginning. He maintained this propaganda on his coins until his death in 411. In 407, Honorius visited Rome and married Thermantia after the death of Maria. Honorius was by this time 23 years old. Meanwhile, Stilicho negotiated with Alaric to march into Gaul to defeat Constantine III. Sick of waiting in Epirus, Alaric had attacked Noricum and demanded 5,000 pounds of gold and 30,000 pounds of silver. Stilicho travelled to Rome to get the Senate to pay the sum. The Senate was outraged, and a senator called Lampadius shouted, "This is not peace, but a pact of slavery." The Senate saw this as appeasement without end, but eventually voted to pay Alaric £4,000 of gold. On the 1st of May 408, Arcadius died, and Theodosius II became emperor. Honorius wanted to travel east, as Sozomen 9.4 writes. Honorius projected a journey to Constantinople in behalf of his nephew to appoint officers faithful to his security and empire, for he held his nephew in the place of his son, and he was fearful lest the boy might suffer on account of his youth, since he would be exposed to plots. But when Honorius was on the very point of setting out on his journey, Stilicho dissuaded him from his design, by proving to him that his presence was requisite in Italy, to repress the schemes of Constantine, who sought to possess himself of the sovereign power at Arles. However, Stilicho still intended to march with supposedly 4 legions to ensure the protection of Theodosius II. The occasion was taken advantage of by the master of the Secretariat, Olympius, who took advantage of popular unrest to persuade Honorius that Stilicho was a traitor. On the 13th of August 408, Honorius and Stilicho summoned his senior officers to Ticinum in preparation to send an army to Gaul to defeat Constantine III, which would join Alaric's foederati as they travelled through Italy. Stilicho was disliked by many and was an extremely controversial figure. Some supported him, such as Olympiodorus, and others loathed him, like Erosius. Rumours spread that Stilicho intended to march east to place his son Eucharius on the eastern throne. Olympius also spread rumours that Stilicho planned to usurp Honorius and become emperor. The Roman army mutinied and went berserk. They hacked down the praetorian prefects of Italy and Gaul, their own officers, and several of Stilicho's supporters in the imperial court. The soldiers then turned their frenzy on the citizens of Ticinum. Zosimus then records, when the evil had advanced beyond cure, the emperor donned a short tunic, without cloak or diadem, and came out into the middle of the city. With very great difficulty, he managed to check the soldiers' rage. The quaestor, Salvius, even clasping the emperor's feet, did not suffice to save the latter from death. The mutiny continued until late afternoon, and the emperor withdrew for fear of being harmed himself. There also perished a host of ordinary people, not easy to calculate. Stilicho was in Bologna, preparing to travel east, when a message reached him from Olympius, placing him under arrest for plotting usurpation. Stilicho travelled to Ravenna, but could not see Honorius. On the 22nd of August 408, Stilicho, who had taken sanctuary in a church, was shown a letter from Honorius granting clemency. After being escorted out of the church, Stilicho was handed a second letter. Zosimus describes what happened next. And while Eucharius his son fled towards Rome, Stilicho was led to his death, when his barbarians and slaves and other associates, of whom there were a great number, made to rescue him from his fate. Stilicho cut short their attempt with terrible threats and submitted his neck to the sword. He was the most moderate of almost all those in power at that time. For though he married Theodosius the Elder's niece and was entrusted with the empires of both his sons, and had been a magister for 23 years, he never sold military office or embezzled the soldiers' allowances. Although he had only one son, he contrived no leading position for him. Olympiodorus adds, and he submitted to execution by the sword, as the result of the murderous and inhumane plotting of Olympius, whom he himself had introduced to the emperor. Stilicho was beheaded by Heraclianus, who was then promoted to Count of Africa. Once Stilicho was dead, Eucharius, his son, fled to Rome. However, he was intercepted and forced to seek sanctuary in a church. The death of Stilicho caused a wave of anti-barbarian hysteria. Roman soldiers massacred the families of the foederati, probably the 12,000 Goths enlisted after the Battle of Faesulae. These men deserted en masse to Alaric's Visigoths. The death of Stilicho also witnessed the end of any control the Ravenna government had over Alaric. He immediately marched on Rome to extract terms from the Senate. Honorius divorced his wife Thermantia. He then demanded that the church hand over Eucharius. The bishop refused. Honorius's agents handed the bishop letters from Honorius that superseded church sanctuary. After the bishop acquiesced, the agents of Honorius dragged out Eucharius and executed him. There was some expedience to this, since Zosimus tells us Alaric was looking for Eucharius to proclaim him emperor. Honorius then issued a damnatio memoriae against Stilicho. Stilicho's brother-in-law, Bathanarius, was executed. Many of Stilicho's associates were tortured. Stilicho was officially blamed for inciting the barbarians to invade the Roman Empire to justify his execution. When Alaric reached Rome in September 408, he again demanded money and land from Honorius. However, he was rejected by Olympius and his new anti-barbarian government. Annoyed, Alaric besieged Rome. The siege caused a famine, with reports of cannibalism in the city. Subsequent panic in Rome caused the mob and the Senate to accuse Serena, the widow of Stilicho, of colluding with Alaric. The Senate also justified themselves because Placidia, Honorius' sister, was in the city. Serena was strangled to death for treason. The death of Stilicho solved nothing. In 408, Alaric lifted his siege after the Senate agreed to meet his terms. Alaric and Honorius entered negotiations which were headed by Jovius, the Praetorian prefect of Italy, and the Pope Innocent I. Meanwhile, Gaul, Spain, and Britain were controlled by Constantine III and his son Constans. As Constantine III pushed into Spain, which had virtually no troops, Honorius' cousins, Didymus and Verenianus, organised their own militia from volunteers and slaves to hold the Pyrenees against Constantine's forces. However, they were defeated and captured. Constantine sent his son, Constans, who was raised to Augustus in 409, to take over Spain. However, dissatisfied with Constantine III's rule, his commander, Gerontius, rebelled in Barcelona and proclaimed his friend and Count of the Domestics, Maximus, as emperor. Alaric demanded money, provisions, and both Master of Infantry and Cavalry titles from Honorius. The emperor refused to grant him the titles, but did agree to giving Alaric food and money. However, the Master of Officers interfered with the peace talks and took no action against Constantine III. Honorius ordered his new Master of Soldiers, Flavius Constantius, to remove Olympius. Olympiodorus, fragment 8.2, reported, Olympius, the man who had plotted against Stilicho, became Master of Officers, then lost the position, then regained it, and finally lost it again. After the second loss, he was later killed by Placidia's husband, Constantius, who first cut off his ears and then had him beaten with clubs. And so, at the end, justice did not allow that impious man to escape unpunished. Honorius then cleansed the government again and punished Olympius's ministers. Honorius recalled elite troops from Dalmatia who attacked Alaric's forces but were routed and suffered heavy casualties. Alaric then besieged Rome for a second time, but the Honorian defences were too strong. Yet the indefensibility of Rome was displayed for another famine broke out, and again there was cannibalism in Rome. Alaric lifted the siege and proclaimed the pagan senator Priscus Attalus as emperor. Alaric hoped Attalus could be used to get the concessions he wanted. However, Attalus was deluded into thinking he was more than a puppet and pretender. He initially minted coins using the title Imperator instead of Dominus Noster, but then stopped. He gave a speech in the Senate detailing his designs of seizing Egypt from the Eastern Roman Empire. He was baptized an Arian Christian and appointed his own ministers, which included making Alaric Master of Infantry. Attalus sent Alaric to besiege Ravenna. Zosimus says, Honorius was terrified and sent ambassadors to ask Attalus to share the empire with him. But Jovius, who had been appointed Praetorian prefect by Attalus, declared that Attalus would leave Honorius neither the title of emperor nor a sound body, but would exile him to an island after maiming him. Everyone was alarmed at the arrogance of his speech, and the Emperor Honorius was ready to flee, having collected for this purpose a great number of ships in the harbour at Ravenna. Just then, 6 cohorts sailed in, which had been expected since the time of Stilicho, but which had only now arrived from the east in accordance with the alliance. They numbered 4,000. As if awakened from a deep sleep, Honorius entrusted the guarding of the walls to these Easterners and decided to stay at Ravenna until the outcome of events in Africa was clearer to him. If Heraclianus was successful and Africa was secure, he would mount a full-scale campaign against Attalus and Alaric. But if the men he had sent into Africa were defeated, he would sail with the ships he had to Theodosius in the east and abandon the Western Empire. Doyle has conjectured that Honorius himself may have requested the troops, or, if we follow Olympiodorus, Theodosius II sent them without telling Honorius. Before Attalus marched against Ravenna, he was advised by his ministers to capture Africa. However, he ignored Alaric's advice to send both Roman and Gothic troops. Instead, he only sent a small force of Roman soldiers. They were easily beaten by Count Heraclian. Meanwhile, Honorius ordered Heraclian to cut off grain shipments to Rome to hinder Attalus. At this time, an envoy from the usurper Constantine, also called Jovius, requested that Honorius recognize Constantine III as a legitimate emperor, Zosimus says. On this request, Honorius, seeing that it was difficult to think about other wars when Alaric's barbarians were close by, and considering moreover his relatives, Verenianus and Didymus, who were in the usurper's hands, granted his petition and sent him an imperial robe as well as sending back the eunuchs. Meanwhile, the Alans, Vandals and Suebi, who had been momentarily pacified by Constantine, attacked the Pyrenees and poured into Spain, unleashing utter destruction. Hydatius, the Spanish bishop of Galatia, recalled, "The barbarians who had entered Spain pillaged it with a vicious slaughter. Pestilence wreaked its own devastation just as vigorously." By the year 410, there were now 6 Roman emperors: the legitimate Theodosius II, Honorius, the usurpers Priscus Attalus, Maximus and Constans, and the temporarily recognised Constantine III. Italy, Gaul and Spain were being ravaged by barbarians, and Britain, revolting from the rule of Constantine III, had to look to its own defences. As Zosimus reports, they reduced the inhabitants of Britain and some of the Gallic provinces to such straits that they revolted from the Roman Empire, no longer submitted to Roman law, and reverted to their native customs. The Britons, therefore, armed themselves and ran many risks to ensure their own safety and free their cities from the attacking barbarians. Procopius adds, "However, the Romans were unable to recover Britain, which remained under tyrants from that time on." Meanwhile, Constantine III watched Italy with envious eyes. He offered to help Honorius defeat the Goths and marched into Italy with his army on the advice of Alabicus, who was a pro-Constantinian courtier at Ravenna. Constantine III managed to squander any goodwill he had gained from Honorius by executing his 2 cousins. Honorius used a military mutiny to purge the government of Olympius, Alabicus, and their adherents. Constantine III's supporters were executed or exiled. Constantine immediately retreated to Arles, where he was besieged by Gerontius. To add to this litany of disasters, the Visigoths sacked Rome. Alaric changed strategies. Attalus had gained him nothing, and Honorius was unwilling to concede his exactions. Alaric, at the behest of Honorius, deposed Attalus. All of Attalus's partisans were pardoned and retained their posts. Alaric moved on Ravenna to make another demand, but Sarus, a Gothic foederati who hated Alaric, with 300 men, ambushed them as they approached the capital. Forced to withdraw, Alaric marched on Rome and besieged it for a third and final time. On the 24th of August, 410, according to Procopius, someone betrayed the Salarian gates and opened it to Alaric's men. Then Rome was sacked by the Visigoths. The contemporary, St. Jerome, in letter 127.12, reacted by saying, "My voice sticks in my throat, and, as I dictate, sobs choke my utterance. The city which had taken the whole world was itself taken." Alaric ordered that his soldiers were not to damage churches or the people inside them. Sozomen 9.9 wrote, "Alaric retraced his steps and returned to Rome, and took it by treachery. He permitted each of his followers to seize as much of the wealth of the Romans as he was able, and to plunder all of the houses. But from respect towards the Apostle Peter, he commanded that the large and very spacious church erected around his tomb should be an asylum. This was the only cause which prevented the entire demolition of Rome. And those who were saved, and they were many, rebuilt the city." Philostorgius, another contemporary church historian, wrote, "The great glory of her erstwhile renown and her far-famed power were then rent asunder by alien fire, and the enemy's sword and captivity at the hands of the barbarian. And while the city lay in ruins, Alaric ravaged Campania, and there died of disease." The sack of Rome was a great shock. It was the first time Rome had been conquered by a foreign enemy since the Gauls in 387 BC. Alaric burned his way to Campania and embarked on ships to invade Sicily. Then a violent storm wrecked his flotilla and forced him to return to Italy. Alaric fell ill and died in Constantia and was buried. His brother-in-law, Ataulf, became the next king of the Visigoths. Within 4 years, the Western Roman Empire had been visited by catastrophes unequalled in number or scale since the 3rd century crisis. Honorius compared the devastation in Spain with the same attacks in the 3rd century during the reign of Gallienus, although he asserted that those were far worse than the present calamities. However, there was still hope. Honorius reports Honorius' change in strategy. The Emperor Honorius, seeing that nothing could be done against the barbarians when so many usurpers were opposed to him, ordered that the usurpers themselves should first be destroyed. Count Constantius was entrusted with the command of this campaign. In the autumn of 411, Count Constantius marched with the Roman army over the Alps and besieged Constantine III in his capital, Arles. Gerontius, who had rebelled against Constantine III, had besieged and killed the usurper Constans in Vienne. When he marched down to attack Constantine, his forces defected to Constantius and he fled. Edebic, one of Constantine's generals, marched down with an army to break the siege. Being drawn into battle by Constantius, Edebic's forces were pincered by Ulfius, Constantius' cavalry commander, and was defeated. Edebic fled but was beheaded, and most of his army joined Constantius after the battle. Constantine surrendered to Constantius. He renounced his imperium, became a monk, and begged for mercy, but he and his son, Julian, were executed. While Constantine was trapped in Arles, Frigeridus reported that Jovinus rebelled in northern Gaul and was backed by local Romans as well as Alan and Burgundian foederati. Gerontius committed suicide with his wife after his remaining soldiers turned on him. Maximus abandoned his usurpation and fled to join the barbarians rampaging through Spain. He was later pardoned by Honorius. Constantius returned to Italy and gave up control of Arles to Jovinus. The latter was able to mint coins there. Jovinus rapidly gained support. The Visigoths, under Ataulf, on the advice of Attalus, marched into Gaul to join him. Sarus, with 18 to 20 men, joined Jovinus as well, but in revenge, Ataulf attacked Sarus with his full army. Sarus and his men fought bravely, and according to Olympiodorus, had to be captured with lassos first before they slew him. In 413, Jovinus raised his brother, Sebastianus, as co-emperor, which Ataulf opposed. Ataulf sent a letter to Honorius, promising the heads of the usurpers for a peace treaty, and Honorius agreed. The Visigoth found and beheaded Sebastianus. Jovinus was then besieged and eventually agreed to surrender. Intending to be sent on to Honorius, the Praetorian prefect of Gaul, Dardanus, executed Jovinus himself. While Constantius and Honorius concluded a peace treaty with Ataulf to exchange Placidia for a large shipment of grain, Heraclian, the Count of Africa, cut off the African grain supply, rebelled, and sailed with his army and fleet to Italy, marching on Ravenna. It has been theorized that he intended to seize control of the government before Constantius became too entrenched and wanted to place himself in that role. Heraclian neither aimed at deposing Honorius nor proclaimed himself emperor. However, Heraclian was defeated in battle by local forces and fled back to Carthage, where he was executed by African authorities. By the end of 413, the usurpers had been defeated. Honorius issued several laws condemning and prescribing Donatism in North Africa. Donatists believed a Christian minister had to be faultless in imitation of Christ, and thus legitimized their ministrations. In 411, he convened the Council of Carthage to deal with Donatism. As a result, most Donatist bishops were exiled, and their churches and property were confiscated. This was part of Honorius's growing intolerance of non-Nicene Christians. From 408 onwards, Honorius issued laws against Jews, heretics, and pagans, which he saw as impeding the state religion. In 408, he passed a law that banned non-Niceans from the imperial bodyguard. In 409, he branded Calicolists, or sky worshippers, guilty of the crime of superstition. In the same law, he reiterated a previous one that banned Jewish proselytizing, which was punished with burning at the stake. However, he also added that admonition would be used as often as possible relating to this law. Those that attempted to obstruct the execution of this law were guilty of high treason. In 410, Honorius passed a law prescribing heretics that secretly practiced their religion. In 423, Honorius banned all heretics from being able to receive privileges. As well as being part of strengthening the Catholic Church, Honorius was able to show through religious legislation that he was a pious prince, a Christian rock in a barbarian storm. Honorius attempted to deal with administrative corruption, a constant in the bureaucracy ever since it had been created by Diocletian. Corruption was also present in the church hierarchy. In 408, Honorius enacted a law that gave bishops the power to defrock dodgy priests. These defrocked priests would then serve in local government, and if they continued corrupt practices, they would receive a ruinous fine. Additional laws were introduced against church corruption in 411 and 416. In 422, a law prohibited clerics from abandoning their wife and children before taking holy orders. While not necessarily a corrupt practice, it was likely to stop families being unsupported due to the growing wave of monasticism at the time. In 412, he passed a law banning child exposure. In 397, Jews were barred from the right to claim church sanctuary. Honorius banned Jews from the civil service or the army, but they could work in law. Although Honorian legislation was generally uncompromising towards Jews, in 412 he passed laws that recognized the Sabbath day as a Jewish holiday, and it was prohibited from compelling them to do anything on that day. Synagogues were protected from attacks by non-Jews. The last law, which was issued 3 times, forbade violence against Jews because of their religion, ensuring the protection of their homes and synagogues. In 399, Honorius declared that only civil authorities had the final say in litigations. However, in 408, Honorius granted episcopal courts the power to legal authority. In 409, Honorius made the forceful removal of fugitives from churches a treasonable offence. In 419, he also established the limits of church sanctuary, since before it was confused and ill-defined. Sanctuary applied to 50 paces from the doors of the church, and the bishop housing them could investigate the matter themselves. Anyone breaking sanctuary laws were punished for sacrilege. In 418, Pelagius, a theologian, opposed predestination in favour of humanity's free will in opposition to the Catholic Church. Augustine pushed for Pelagianism to be outlawed, especially since it gained a wide following. At the Council of Carthage, Pelagius and his views were excommunicated and condemned. The spread of Pelagianism and its emphasis of personal initiative was a dangerous prospect for the emperor and his overburdened subjects. In 419, a papal election required the emperor's mediation. Eulalius was chosen by former adherents of Pope Zosimus. Meanwhile, Boniface was elected pope by senior clergymen. The prefect of Rome, Symmachus, was asked to mediate, but failed and asked Honorius for help. Honorius supported Eulalius and granted amnesty to Boniface's partisans, but exiled Boniface himself for seemingly usurping the pontificate. However, Boniface did not agree. He marched on Rome and was arrested by Symmachus. His supporters appealed to Honorius, who revoked Eulalius's pontificate and demanded they bring their quibble to him. Once talks failed, Honorius invited many Italian and Gallic bishops, including St. Augustine, to a conclave at Spoleto. Achillius was appointed to perform papal duties in the interim. Eulalius reoccupied the Lateran Basilica in a vain attempt to assert his right to the papacy. This caused a breakout of riots between the two factions in Rome. The prefect pacified the mob, and Honorius expelled Eulalius, with Boniface becoming pope. Another papal controversy arose in 422, because Eulalius tried again, this time with the support of Placidia. Honorius built a church in Ravenna to St. Lawrence. He also oversaw the construction of other churches in Ravenna, including the Basilica of Ursus. In Rome, he built the Basilica of St. Paul outside the walls. Honorius also finished the Basilica of St. Prudentiana, begun by Theodosius I. Heraclian's usurpation resulted in the breakdown of relations between Honorius and Ataulf, because the Romans failed to pay the grain shipment. The Visigoths attacked Marseille, but were defeated. Ataulf then captured Narbonne, Toulouse, and Bordeaux. In 414, he proclaimed Priscus Attalus as emperor again, and married Placidia. Attalus' formerly abandoned use of the title Imperator was readopted for his second reign on his coins. Honorius was determined to recover his sister, and Constantius hoped to marry Placidia himself, bringing him into the Theodosian family. Constantius won a crushing victory over the Visigoths near Narbonne and recaptured the city. The son of Ataulf and Placidia, Theodosius, died in infancy as the Visigoths moved into Spain upon the approach of Constantius's Roman army. Theodosius was buried in a silver coffin and was later interred in Honorius's mausoleum in Rome. In 414, Priscus Attalus was deserted, while the Visigoths retreated into Spain once they looted the cities they had occupied. He then captured Barcelona. Orosius amusingly remarked about Attalus: Alaric, who made, unmade, remade, and again unmade his emperor, Attalus, merely a figurehead of sovereignty. The Visigothic nobility were disillusioned by Ataulf's antagonism towards Honorius and failure against Constantius's army. They perhaps even rejected his marriage. Ataulf was assassinated soon after the death of his son in 415. Sergeric, the brother of Sarus, became the next Visigothic king. Sergeric took the opportunity to murder his enemies and humiliate Placidia, but was himself assassinated within a week and replaced by his murderer, Wallia. A band of Visigoths attempted to cross to Africa, but failed. Count Constantius blockaded the Visigoths, who were brought to starvation. The Vandals, in Spain, sold them grain at a spoonful for a solidus. Wallia sensibly established a peace treaty with the Romans and released Placidia. Attalus was captured as Constantius advanced. In 415, Fermantia, Honorius' former wife, died. In 416, Honorius held a triumph in Rome for the defeat of the usurper Attalus. It was the last triumph held by a Western Roman emperor. A fragment of Philostorgius records what occurred. Afterwards, Rome recovered from these calamities, and people settled there. The emperor visited it, and encouraged its settlement with hand and tongue, and ascending a dais, the first step of which he compelled Attalus to bestride. Lacuna. He cut off 2 fingers of his right hand, one of which, lacuna, the other is called the forefinger, and he banished him to the island of Lipara, inflicting no further penalty, but even providing the necessities of life. Honorius inflicted the same punishment Attalus intended for him. In 417, Honorius, probably for dynastic reasons, forced Placidia to marry Constantius. Apparently, Honorius had to lead her by the hand to the wedding. Constantius, from the few descriptions we have of him, was a gruff and rough soldier. Constantius also wanted this marriage for the natural influence it would give him. During that year, a general called Exurperantius led a campaign against the Bagaudae in Amorica. The Bagaudae had rebelled against Constantine III and remained outside Roman authority. The success of the campaign re-established firm Roman control to the river Loire. In 418, Wallia and Honorius came to terms. Honorius could not destroy the Visigoths, but neither could the Visigoths continue their nomadic rampage. The decision had several benefits. The Western Roman army, which by 418 had been gutted by decades of war, desperately needed more troops. In addition to fighting the West's enemies, the Visigoths could serve as a powerful tool against any potential usurpers in Gaul, considering Constantine III, Jovinus, and Attalus had been established there. It was a significant concern. In addition, with Gaul generally secure, the Ravenna government could turn its attention to Spain. The Suebi and Hasting Vandals had conquered Galatia. The Silling Vandals occupied Baetica. The Alans took over Lusitania and Carthaginisus, and Tarraco was under Roman control, though formerly under the usurper Maximus and Gerontius. As Roman allies, the Visigoths were asked to launch an offensive against the Vandals. In 417 to 418, the Visigoths were consistently victorious against the Silling Vandals, who took heavy losses. In 418, the Visigoths then advanced against the Alans. Spain remained a war zone for the rest of Honorius' reign, but vast swathes of land were rapidly reconquered. In 419, Constantius decided to withdraw the Visigoths from Spain and settle them in Gaul. They were granted Aquitania Secunda from Toulouse to the Bay of Biscay along the Garonne Valley as Western Roman foederati. There has been great debate over the Visigothic settlement. Was it from a position of Roman strength or weakness? Was the aim to use the Visigoths to defend against Saxon pirates, the Bagaudae, or serve as a counterweight to the Vandals, and vice versa? Did Aquitaine need defending because of its wealth, or was the region chosen because it had been devastated, and the Visigoths would revitalize it? Were the Visigoths there to maintain the loyalty of the otherwise rebellious Gallic provinces? The Bagaudae had already been pacified, and Gaul was generally secure. The location of the Visigothic settlement makes no sense to defend against Saxon pirates in northern Gaul. The Vandals and Alans had been virtually defeated to the point where Count Constantius was confident that Roman forces were sufficient to deal with them. The economic conditions are contradictory and difficult to say with any certainty. The last observation seems the most correct. The Romans, from a position of strength, wanted a large army in Gaul to defend it from foreign attack and usurpation. The Visigoths themselves had diminished as a threat. They had caused untold devastation, but had secured nothing long-term. Many of them had died from fighting and famine, and had been consistently defeated by Western Roman field armies. occasionally winning ambushes and when fighting smaller forces. The Visigoths had entered Rome due to betrayal, not because they overcame Honorius' improved Aurelian walls. The location of the Visigothic settlement meant they could be quickly deployed to Spain, Gaul, or Italy. They were also strategically placed to help re-establish control in northern Gaul. There is some indication that the settlement was not designed to be permanent, but became so during the events following Honorius' reign. Constantius reorganised southern Gaul and adopted Arles as the prefectural capital. In 418, Honorius reinstituted the Council of the Seven Provinces, which now met to conduct the business of the southern Gallic provinces. The province of Aquitania Secunda and Novem Populana remained under Roman governors, implying the area had not been handed over to the Visigoths in an administrative sense. Count Constantius had successfully placated the Visigoths, pacified the Bagaudae, and now focused his efforts on restoring Spain. An opportunity arose when the Suebi and Hasting Vandals fought each other. The Vandals besieged the Suebi in the mountains. In 419, Maximus, probably the same usurper created by Gerontius, rebelled again, as the Gallic Chronicle of 452 says. Maximus the Tyrant took control of Spain by force. Maximus may have been leading a provincial rebellion in his own right, or served as a barbarian puppet. There are no details. In 419, or 420, Maurocellus and Asterius campaigned in Spain. Maurocellus, the vicar of Spain, defeated the Hasting Vandals, which caused them to flee to Baetica. Meanwhile, Asterius, the Count of Spain, in the same operation, led his forces to defeat and capture the usurper Maximus by 421. In 422, Maximus and Jovinian, perhaps one of his partisans, were sent back to Ravenna and paraded during Honorius' Trichonalia celebrations. They were then executed. By 421, the Romans had enforced enough of their own authority in Spain to re-establish their administration as far as Lusitania. The Suebi were hemmed in Galicia, and the Vandals and Alans in Baetica. For having restored much of the Western Roman Empire, and having defeated or pacified almost all of their enduring enemies, Constantius was proclaimed emperor by Honorius, and was clearly marked out as his heir presumptive. Though tentative, the crises of Honorius' reign had seemingly passed. The dual reign of Honorius and Constantius III lasted 8 months. Olympiodorus described the event. Olympiodorus, fragment 33. Constantius became co-emperor with Honorius, who appointed him, but rather unwillingly. Placidia was proclaimed Augusta, jointly by her brother and husband. He also mentions how Honorius, Constantius, and Placidia proclaimed Valentinian, the latter's son, as nobilissimus. As emperor, Constantius III expelled the Pelagian heretics from Rome. The main issue of their joint reign was a dispute with the East. When Constantius III was proclaimed emperor, Theodosius II was informed about the proclamation. Pictures of the new emperor were sent to Constantinople. However, Theodosius II rejected Constantius III's election. Olympiodorus continues, Constantius fell ill and regretted his elevation, that he no longer had the freedom to leave and go off wherever and in whatever manner he wished, and could not, because he was emperor, enjoy the pastimes which he had been accustomed to enjoy. With him died the hostility towards the East, and the expedition which he had been preparing, because they did not approve his proclamation as emperor. On the 2nd of September, 421, Constantius III died of pleurisy. The death of Constantius restored relations with Theodosius II. In consort with each other, Honorius and Theodosius II passed laws concerning taxation, personal debt, and widows' property rights. In 422, Honorius held his 13th and last consulship. In Spain, Castinus, the master of soldiers who replaced Constantius, and Boniface, led a campaign against the Vandals in Baetica. He had a large army of Roman soldiers and Gothic federates. After besieging the Vandals and nearly bringing about a victory, Castinus foolishly decided to fight them in a pitched battle and lost. The Goths had joined the Vandals mid-battle and betrayed the Romans. Castinus fled back to Tarraco after his stinging defeat. Boniface questioned Castinus's skill and ability to command so much that he deserted the army and travelled straight to Africa, where he took charge of the province. Castinus's defeat, though not immediately damaging, had long-term consequences. The Vandals had not been totally defeated, and it would be some time before another Roman army maintained the offensive in Spain. Honorius's relationship with Placidia collapsed after Constantius III's death. Olympiodorus says, fragment 38, "The affection of Honorius towards his sister grew so great after the death of her husband Constantius that their immoderate pleasure in each other and their constant kissing on the mouth caused many people to entertain shameful suspicions about them. But as a result of the efforts of Spedusa and Placidia's nurse, Elpidia, to both of whom she paid great attention, and through the cooperation of Leontius, her steward, this great affection was replaced by such a degree of hatred that fighting often broke out in Ravenna, and blows were delivered on both sides, for Placidia was surrounded by a host of barbarians because of her marriage to Ataulf and Constantius. Finally, as a result of this flare-up of enmity, and the hatred as strong as their previous love, when Honorius proved the stronger, Placidia was exiled to Byzantium with her children. The deterioration of the emperor's relationship with his sister and their closeness deserves some attention. Olympiodorus was an Eastern historian and not generally privy to the private dealings of the Western emperor, and so what he reports are rumours. The later Gallic Chronicle of 452 says Placidia was discovered plotting against Honorius and was exiled, indicating there is more nuance here than just a potentially incestuous affair gone awry. It is possible Honorius's sudden, extreme change in behaviour was due to his illness, or he would die later that year of dropsy. Could this have simply been a brother comforting his mourning sister, and then viciously turned into scandal by the poisonous words of Placidia's retinue? Prosper confirms Olympiodorus's mention of her fleeing for her life. Honorius might have exiled Placidia because her retinue ran riot in the capital. In any case, it would be wise not to accept gossip as fact. While some historians have seen the death of Constantius III as a period of army commanders vying for political influence between Castinus, Boniface, and Felix, this seems to be a transposition of the events of Valentinian III's early reign. While sources say Castinus and Boniface fell out, this seems far more a question of generals disagreeing and potentially Boniface becoming a rogue agent, loyal only to Empress Placidia. But the rest of the empire under Honorius's last 2 years seemed to have been under his firm control, with no one becoming a new generalissimo after Constantius III. Honorius continued to legislate. On the 6th of August, 423, he passed laws concerning senatorial criminality, the curtailing of legal status for barbarian freedmen. He granted due process for plaintiffs and banned military executions in Rome without the prefect's consent. On the 15th or 27th of August, 423, our sources differ. Honorius died of edema, age 39. He was buried in St. Peter's Basilica in Rome. With no heir, Theodosius II became sole ruler of the Roman Empire. In reflection, the reign of Honorius had left the Western Roman Empire with less than when he became emperor in 395. Parts of Gaul, Spain, and Illyricum had been lost to foreign invasion. Countless towns, farms, and of course Rome itself had been laid waste. Britain was lost. A contemporary Gallic writer said of Honorius, Narrative of the Emperors of the House of the Valentinians and Theodosians, chapter 6, Honorius ruled 32 years. The state suffered many wounds during his reign. The most biting was the capture and ruin of the city of Rome by Alaric, king of the Goths. The sister of the emperor, the Augusta Placidia, is a blot on the public life of the times. Gaul and Spain were ravaged by barbarian peoples, the Vandals, Sueves, and Alans, and thoroughly destroyed. The British provinces were forever removed from the Roman name. Yet, while this same emperor accomplished nothing worthwhile against external enemies, he enjoyed the utmost fortune in the destruction of usurpers. Most of them he defeated, seized, and destroyed. The Notitia Dignitatum of the Western Roman Empire, though orderly in presentation, reveals the desperate measures taken to cope with these calamities. Out of the 189 Western committances in 395, 76 had been wiped out by 420. Meanwhile, 92 committances had been raised during Honorius' reign, of which 62, 2/3, were limitani converted into pseudo-committances. On the other hand, prospects were also quite good. The Visigoths had been finally pacified. Most of the frontiers were quiet and had stabilised. Britain, though lost for now, had the potential to be recovered. The Vandals and Suebi were fleeing before triumphant Roman armies. Most importantly, despite 9 separate usurpations, all of them had been defeated. Marcus, Gratian, Constantine III, Constans, Priscus Attalus, Maximus, Jovinus, Sebastianus, and Heraclian. Part of the reason for these improving circumstances must be attributed to the Emperor Honorius, the man who had survived it all. From the evidence, Honorius was a keen legislator on military, economic, administrative, and religious affairs. He was capable of making difficult choices in the face of multiple crises. He had political savvy, turning on the increasingly unpopular Stilicho, eliminating the useless Olympius, and endorsing the competent Constantius III, eventually centering his succession plans around him before they fell apart. While he remained throughout his reign a figurehead of an emperor, he nevertheless deserves far more credit than Procopius was willing to give him. If you have enjoyed the video, please do like and subscribe. If you wish, click the bell to receive notifications from my channel. Thank you very much to my generous patrons for your invaluable support, and this has been Western Roman History.